So again, today we're covering feasibility studies, project charter, and status report in that order. Our training project and the training projects we've created for you are all non-capital projects. So those are the workflows that we will be walking through for these three business processes. However, they're not too dissimilar from the capital, and I will show the capital workflow as well. For those following along in the binder, this is section 3.7.2, completing a non-capital feasibility study. That's where we're going to start. And just a reminder, you can always access the business process specific help by clicking the little drop down next to the question mark in any business process log and going to that BP's specific help, downloads that in a PDF. Okay, so just a quick overview of the workflow for feasibility studies before we create a record. And this is just to give an overview of the overall business process. What we're looking at here is the non-capital workflow. So the PM will create, and from there they have two options. They can hold for review, which puts this in this revision step, which is basically allows them to send it to themselves if they need to update it for more information later. As we'll see, the form for non-capital can be quite long, but it's meant as a good checklist to make sure you're having a complete conversation with your client. And of course, in the case of a non-capital project, this is what is oftentimes referred to as the initial consultation. So whether you want to complete that form in Unifier with the client, or if you want to print that out and kind of highlight what you want to talk about and kind of fill that out on paper when you're doing your face-to-face with your client, put that in Unifier later. This supports both approaches, and I'll show you how to print that. The other option is to send for review. So if you've entered all of your information, let's say you're a new PM and you want to send it to your supervisor just to take a look at it, or if it's got something you're less familiar with and you want to send it to another PM for peer review, you can do that. Please note this review step is consensus approval, which means if you send it to more than one person, they all need to complete the task before you get it back. So if you send it to two people, they both need to take action. There's no sequence, so either of them can do it at any point in time, but just be aware of that. This review step is meant for consensus approval, so you only want to include folks that you know or need to respond. Once you're done with the feasibility study, you can mark it as approved. There is an option to promote for CapGov approval. There is the rare instance where capital governance will want visibility of a special non-capital project. More than likely, you will be informed of that from Chris or Stacy, and you'll know if that's the case. When you do that, that's going to automatically create a status report, which gets promoted for CapGov review, and we'll show how that BP works as well in this training. And if you feel like you've just messed up or the project isn't going anywhere, you can also use this terminated option. Now, an approved feasibility study is a gate condition for the feasibility phase. So in order to meet that condition, you will need to get through either approved or promote for CapGov approval. This is the non-capital workflow, excuse me. And I'll quick preview the capital workflow as well, although again, we'll be pushing a record through non-capital for the basis of our training here. Similar steps, except this one does require a review, in which they can review with comments or no comments and send back for revisions. It allows you to have a conversation and some back and forth. And of course, in the case of a capital project, you'll be promoting this for capital governance review, but also there is the option to terminate. Okay, with that, I'm going to go back into my project. Again, this is non-capital, so when we say feasibility, in this case, we're referring to the initial consultation, but we wanted common terminology between project types. You find feasibility studies under the scope management folder. So go ahead and click create, and then I am going to resize this window to make the most use of my monitor screen here. Of course, we see the project information block pre-populated. There is the requirement to select our contracting method. Some projects may have multiple feasibility studies with different contracting methods, so we didn't lock this down at all. In this case, I'm just going to select design, bid, build. The only other required field is a brief description, so I'm just going to go ahead and put in initial consultation. And the date that I had it, we're just going to say today. And then as we scroll down, you can see there's a lot of fields in here. Previous work with FM, role in project, contacts. And then in here, we have pre-populated some guidance or questions that you could ask the client to help provide some additional context. So have you worked with FactMan before? If so, what was the nature of the project, the outcome? Again, this is meant to be a list to make sure that we cover all the possible scope. And you may not answer all of these questions. Not all of these questions would necessarily apply to every project. If you're the type of PM that likes to have a face-to-face with the client, you don't want to have a computer open when you're talking during the consultation, you can simply print this out, and then you could fill it out on paper. And then fill it out in Unifier later. To print this, just go up here to the hamburger menu, print, and then select PDF. It'll prompt you to save any changes that you've made. Just go ahead and select yes. The default print options, we probably don't need the workflow progress if you're just using this as a checklist. Really what we want are the fields on the form. So you could uncheck workflow progress or leave it on there and ignore it. And then print. All right. And it will print all those questions. All right, back to my form here. So when you're actually filling this out with the responses to each of these, you'll want to, you may want to remove the default text. You can resize these boxes as well. So if you've got kind of a long answer, you can use this little few lines in the corner. Again, the questions are meant to help you along with the conversation to fill out these answers. So you can remove the default text and then put in the answer. These are not, as I mentioned, they're not required because not all questions will apply to all projects. So if you did have a question that didn't apply, unless Catherine's going to disagree, I would just say remove the default text and leave it blank so that we know that there was no conversation about it, about that particular item. Okay, so I'm going to fill this out from the perspective of I'm going to do it on paper first. So I've created this, I've printed it out. I'm going to go ahead and send. And I'm going to hold for review, which sends it to myself for revisions. And I'm doing this because I haven't filled this out yet. I'm going to do this after I have the conversation. So I'm just getting my list and starting this off. And then outside of Unifier, I can go have this conversation, or I can pull this up in the meeting on my laptop and fill this out as well, depending on your favorite approach. Of course, once I send that out, it creates a task for me sent for revisions. And this just means that I can make revisions to this form, which of course I'm going to want to do to be able to enter in the client's responses. So I have a feasibility record sent for revisions. So at this point, I've had a conversation with the client outside of Unifier, and I've got my notes. Or alternatively, I'm opening this up in front of the client and entering it as we're having the conversation. Of course, I accept the task, which then refreshes the form, so I have an editable view. Again, for anyone who missed it, to print, it's simply this little hamburger menu, and then print. That's available in every business process. So the PDF print's kind of the Unifier default print. It's not visually appealing, but it does get all the information out. And for some business processes, we have a custom formatted custom print for notice to proceed. A lot of the state forms we're generating custom prints because it's a very specific format that's required. But the PDF and HTML are just kind of the built-in, the ugly prints as we call them, but they're still useful. Okay, so now I have my answers. I do not have a good set of answers that I could type in here, but this could take some time depending on how many of these you're going to be filling out. But again, we would just replace this with okay. And as Catherine mentioned in the chat, some of these questions you might need to touch base with FM engineers. So depending on what they want to do and what it impacts. So for the sake of brevity, and not to go through every individual question, because from a unifier perspective, I don't have a good explanation for each of these, and that's why the core team came up with these questions to be able to help you answer each one of these. But let's say I've filled this out. If I had any napkin sketches or anything else, I could attach that here. For capital projects, you'll probably have a much more robust feasibility product to be attaching. But this allows it to associate it with the record, and then if you do send it for review, they can review those attachments as well. Again, if we ever forgot where we were in the workflow, there's always the workflow progress tab. And so I can see creation was completed, and now I'm in revisions. If I want to see where I can go from here before I click send, I can always view the graphic. So now if I need to send it out for review, I can select review. Again, I might be sending this to my supervisor or another PM or an engineer to review some of the scope if there's something I'm not familiar with, or might have a large impact on the cost of the project, or setting expectations with the client. Or if we've had the conversation, everything's good, I can just mark this as approved. So I'm gonna go ahead and click send. Again, if I select review, I can send this to multiple people. So let's say I'm gonna send it to myself, I'm gonna send it to Lainey. And this will give them, I believe it's 3 working days for a task due date, just to make sure that they don't sit on it forever. It's just setting an expectation and a due date. But both Eric and Lainey do have to reply in order for this to come back to me to make any changes. Of course, you can just send it to one person as well. So if I only wanted to send it to myself, I could just hit the X next to Lainey. This particular review is anybody who's been added to the project, so you're not limited. Again, by default, all of the reviewers are added to every project. So if there's a specific in-house engineer or something, they should be available to select, or OIT, those types of folks, as well as your supervisor or anybody else on the project team. Okay, and reminder, anytime you get a task due date, the system will notify you once the task due date has been passed. So you do get an extra reminder there. So I'm going to go ahead and send it to myself just to show you what they'll see. So let's just say let's say Eric's my supervisor. We'll get a task, feasibility study sent for review. Now, if I just wanted them to review it, I could send it. If I wanted somebody to review something specific, I wouldn't want to just send them this and hope they pick up what they need to review. I'd want to add something in the comments tab before I send it, so they know what to look at. So they'll get a task for review. It will indicate their due date. Once they accept, they aren't able to Just give us a minute to load. They're not able to make any changes, but they can review everything you've entered and any attachments you've added, and then provide comments. So if it was something specific, they would see your comment here. And of course, we always instruct folks to always check the comments tab. Now, one thing that's been added in one of the recent versions that you may have noticed or may not have noticed is when I add a comment, a little speech bubble shows up on the comments tab. So it used to not do that. You'd have to come and click on comments to see if there are any comments. But now this little icon will always let you know that comments have been added. They also did that with attachments. So if you do add an attachment, you get a little icon there. And so at a glance, you can see if there's been any attachments or comments. Okay, when they're done with their comment, they will send. They only have one option, which is to return it back to you as the PM. Again, if there were multiple reviewers, they could be taking action at the same time and adding their comments. That's why we lock down the form, so nobody's overriding each other. They're just working through comments. And then once they've all responded, it will come back to you as a task sent for revisions. And now I can see I've got comments. So if I needed to make changes based on those comments, after I accept the task, I'll be able to make any edits to the feasibility study. And once complete, I can mark as approved. So let's say I've reviewed my comment. I've made changes if needed. I'm going to go ahead and click send and select approved. Again, promote for CapGov approval is only for those rare non-capital projects or capital governments want some visibility into. So with the approved selected, we see it just sends for end, drops out of my task list. But if I go back to feasibility studies under scope management, I see the record there as approved. That's feasibility studies. So next we're going to move on to project charter. Before we create a record, I'm going to do a quick overview of the workflow for those as well. Again, we'll be walking through non-capital as our example, but I will show both non-capital and capital workflows. Based on some of the support we've provided so far, there's a little bit of confusion, I know, with the workflow on this one. So right now we're looking at the non-capital workflow for the project charter. And I just want to explain the workflow here. So the PM will create, and they're going to send for review and comment or no comment. But this step is meant as an internal review. So if you're going to send it to a peer, you want somebody else to look at the project charter before it goes to the client for approval. That's what this step is for. Although you can select the client, this is not their approval step. And this is also another consensus step. So if you send it for more than, excuse me, if you send it to more than one person for comments, they all need to respond. So make sure you only send it to those folks that you want to comment on it. If it's not something that needs internal review, you can just send it to yourself and then send it on for approval. Approval, you'll select the client for approval. They'll be able to approve from the email or reject with comments. In the email, they can add their comments in the email, which creates a comment in the record and unifier. And if they reject, it will come back to you for revisions. So just a reminder, this review and comment isn't for client approval. This is just for internal approval. If you don't need to do that, I would recommend you just send it to yourself and then send it on to the client. Okay, I'll take a quick look at the capital workflow. So this one has a lot more approvals in it. Because we have multiple approvers for each step, we couldn't list the approvers for each one. So maybe it's something that's we can follow up with as far as who is on each one of these steps, but there's a very specific order and sequence that the project charter needs to go through for approvals. All right, I'm gonna hop into my training project and create a project charter. So project charter can be found under governance management. In the governance management folder. I've already created one, but for our training here, I'm going to create another one. And you'll see two options here. So if you have a project charter early on, you want to make changes to that project charter and send that through for client review and approval. You can copy an existing project charter. So if you're going to revise one, this allows you to copy it so you don't have to re-enter that information. But you would actually, if you do want to copy it, you're going to want to select the gear icon and copy from here. Unfortunately, we can't hide it from here and only show it in the gear icon. That's currently a unifier limitation. And I believe this is noted in the help file, but if you do want to copy an existing one, you'll want to hit the gear icon and then choose the copy existing project charter workflow. I'm going to create just a new blank one so we can demonstrate what that looks like. So create non-capital. Now, when I open this up, it's got a much shorter list than our feasibility studies here, but there's 12 boxes of items here. We do have this mapped from the feasibility form. So if I copy from feasibility by selecting my little picker button here, it will show me all of my feasibility studies. I can select it and it'll copy the information in. And now you can see this is why we want to get rid of that default text, because it's going to copy it all into your project charter. And because some of these fields are mapped to multiple questions from the initial consultation form, You'll want to review what got copied in and make sure it still makes sense, because there's a couple of fields in that feasibility form that talk about key stakeholders and their role. So those answers to those multiple fields will get all put into this one field. So you'll want to review and update as needed. Now, not all fields are copied over. So deliverables, our high-level risks and budget. Some of these won't be copied in from feasibility because we don't ask it in the way that we want to enter it into the project charter. So we'll just go in and fill out our project charter. What's the project goals and objectives? Here we have helper text not in the field. So why is the project being done? What's the project being solved? Again, the purpose of copying the feasibility is just to help you copy in that information that was entered that may need some rewriting, but still is pertinent to the question here. Project priorities and scope, key stakeholders and their roles, the deliverables for the project. You would not put etc., but you would list the deliverables. Apologies, I get into bad habits. Any assumptions for the project, any constraints, and those are some things that might be updated as you go and learn more about the project. Any high-level risks, be they inherent, political, or otherwise. A budget range. We're early on in the project, so we might not have a very definitive idea of the cost, but we'll put in a range and what the anticipated source of funds is. Schedule, contracting method. And now, I mean, several contracting methods may be considered during feasibility. As of the project charter, we want to select the contracting method we think we're going to go forward with. Again, this does not apply the contracting method to your project. That is a separate email request. And then enter the contracting method rationale. And then any additional notes if we're headed towards lead certification and others. Okay, again, we can add attachments or comments. So in this case, if we were going to send it to someone else to review and we wanted to provide them some additional instruction, we could do so here. Now, in this version of Unifier, there are certain instances where it defaults the hide to checked. We've definitely run that up the flagpole to Oracle that we want this to be an option to change, but unfortunately, we don't have that ability to control it at this time. So always double check whether you're adding comments here or to an attachment. And uncheck that hide. If you leave it checked, you will be the only one who can see that comment. Post the comment. I'm going to go ahead and send. As we saw in the workflow, this is going to go to the review and comment or no comment. If you didn't need anyone else to review it, you could just send it to yourself. Again, the system is going to define a 3 working day task due date. I'm going to send it to myself for review. So this could be yourself, or this could be someone else you wanted to review it, whether you're performing the action or they are. It's the same activity. So I'll go ahead and hit send. Project charter is created. I now see it in my project charter log view here. If I go to my tasks, you'll have to ignore this other project charter. Again, this is a training project, so we're kind of creating multiple records. But this is the project charter I just sent. It was sent for review and comment or no comment. If I want to know who else it was sent to, or I forgot who I sent it to a couple days later, again, we can always go to the workflow progress and see. In this case, I can see that this was only sent to Eric and he hasn't started it yet. Of course, as soon as he does, whether by opening it and clicking accept task, or for anybody who attended the intermediate basics may know, you can also accept task from this little check icon. As soon as I do that, I now see that Eric's in progress for that step, which means he's accepted the task and assumably he's taking action on it. So when I open this task, because I've already accepted it from the little icon here, I won't have to accept it in the upper right. So they will get a task to review. They won't be able to make any changes to the form, but they can see your comments if you've posted anything to review something specific, and then they could add their comments here as well. Okay, and of course, anytime you're making comments, if it shows the little pencil icon, that means you can still make changes to it. If you haven't seen that before, you can just right click on the pencil icon. It allows you to edit that, copy the comment or delete the comment if you need to. I'm going to go ahead and hit send. This is a draft comment until I hit send, which means nobody else can see my comment until I hit send. So if they had comments that required revision, they would select revise charter or consensus. So if everyone's good, or you've sent this to yourself, they would select consensus. If you sent it to 3 people and 2 select consensus and 1 selects revised charter, it goes to the revision step. So be aware of that. Okay, so in this case, I've just sent it to myself. I'm good with the charter. It's now going to send for approval, which is going to the client's group. So for anybody following along in your projects, we're going to have to approve these project charters for you to move them along. And the client will get an email that they can respond to. That will look like this. Project number, the project charter has been sent to you for approval, and then the project name. Now, apologies because I'm getting a bunch of these, so I'm trying to find the right one. Because I'm also getting the, there we go. And then the client will have these buttons at the bottom to reject with comments or approve. Either one of these buttons will generate an email. So I will click approve. It generates a new email with a very specific subject that can't be edited. If they had any comments, they can simply type them in the email. And if I needed to CC someone else, I could do that as well. Just don't change who it's going to. And then send. That does go to the system. It can take a few minutes to show up. We have had instances where a client might have their emails forwarded to another email address, or for whatever reason, their email address doesn't match what we have set up for them in Unifier, and in which case those approvals fail. So that can occur otherwise, but within a few minutes, that approval should happen in Unifier. Now, I need to get these other 3 approvals in. So I'm just going to go ahead and proxy in for Lainey and Lori so we can move this on. I'm just going to pause the screen sharing quick, just so we don't have anybody watching the recording and thinking that this next step is required, because again, I'm just acting on behalf of the client to approve it. Actually, I'm going to pause the. Okay, so once the clients approve the project charter, the system will populate an approval date. Our status is approved, and we've reached the end of our workflow. Now I'll have Lainey approve everyone else's. I'm going to move on to status reports, and then we'll come back at the end to show you how this is all updated in Gates. So for anybody who has been entering a project charter in your training project, I realize that's not everyone on the call, so for those of you who haven't been, you can ignore that. But for folks who have been entering a project charter and sent it to the approval step, Lainey will be approving those in the background as I move on, just to make sure that that project charter gets fully approved in your project. Okay, so we've covered feasibility studies and project charter, which leaves us with status report. One thing I did forget to mention in project charter was the help file section. That was 3.1.3, but now we'll be moving on to status report, which can be found 3.10.5. Or again, you can always download that section specifically from the help menu. So I'm going to go ahead and show you the workflow first. So this is typically for capital projects, but there are sometimes non-capital projects that the capital governance wants some visibility into. But this is also a way for you to generate the quad chart. So if anybody's asking for a quad chart, we do have that in Unifier now, and that is coming from the status report BP. So if you just need to generate a quad chart, you can do that using this process. Okay, so here's the workflow. You can create the status report and you can send for updates. This just sends it to yourself if you've started it and want to finish it later. For those projects that this is going to go to CapGov for review, you can send it on for CapGov approval. This goes to Chris Ewing, and there's a whole process here that takes place in tandem with the capital governance meetings, and he may send it back for revision, approve or no go. You'll get notified of that. If you do send it to yourself for updates, you also just have the ability to approve it. So if this is a project where you need to generate a quad chart, but this isn't something that's going to CapGov, you can just use this approved status to end it, skipping the CapGov review. This can be done at any time. So let's go back to the project and create, and then I'll show you how to generate that quad chart print as well. So the first tab we see is just some general information. It's going to pull in the project summary from our description in the project information BP. So if we need to update that or change that, we can do that here. And then it's also going to ask us some status details. So these create the red, yellow, and green indicators on the quad chart. So whether or not we think our budget status is red, yellow, or green. Right now, this is just the creator's opinion. We don't have defined metrics in order to automate this. So you're providing your opinion on where you're at with the budget, with the schedule, with any risks and concerns, and then the overall project health. I'm going to call it green. And then you'll see a number of tabs at the top. So questions and recommendations. Status summary. Project risks and concerns. Budget and schedule. I'm going to actually put something in each of these and show you that. But these correspond to the quad chart report, the 4 quadrants. So budget and schedule get combined into that upper right quadrant, but these other ones will populate the other areas of the quad chart. So if I had any questions or recommendations for capital governance, or just that I want to appear in my quad chart, I can add those here by simply clicking add. These are all line items, so you can add multiple questions or recommendations. And then when you hit save, it adds it. If I hit save and new, it would provide a blank field for me to enter into my next one. I also have the ability to simply copy, or if I've got a bunch, I can switch to that grid view, again, by clicking on the Windows icon, and then just hitting add to create additional rows. This might be something for Oracle. I'll have to follow up on that error message. It looks like it's still hit save. There we go. So I could enter my recommendation number 2. And of course, anytime you enter something, it's going to show as green until you save. And then again, I always recommend going back to this form view before you go anywhere else, simply because of that error that you sometimes get about having not saved information. Here we can add a status summary, and it works just like every other line item form, so I'm not going to go through the functionality. Risks and concerns. Maybe I'll add multiple. So those are all fairly straightforward. Then we come to the budget. And then we'll hit add. So these are very specific budget categories. Again, for portfolio reporting. because we're not entering the budget in the budget BP in terms of planned, projected, and actual, we're entering it here as well. And the breakdown is different from the cost code structure as well. So the other reason we're having you enter the budget here separately is this is also point in time reporting. So, allowing you to be able to generate your quad chart without necessarily having to wait for something else in the system to update, like an approval for a budget change or something. But once you have your first one entered, you can always copy your status report. So you would always have your prior amounts. So let's say this professional services, we planned for 100,000. We're currently projecting 125,000. And in this case, we don't have an actual amount. Infrastructure and site. Oops. And it looks like instead of hitting save and add new, I hit save. So that's why it just overrode our first one. But that's fine. We can go ahead and hit add and re-enter professional services. And I think this time I'm going to go ahead and put in an actual amount. So let's say we're halfway through design roughly. These are my actuals to date. And then similar with schedule, we've got plan, projected, and actual per the milestones. So this is a good one where you might want to just use that grid view. I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel. So now I can put in my, let's say, design start, VOR approval, construction start, and occupancy. It's going to go ahead and hit save, make sure I don't lose anything before I enter in my dates. You can also copy and paste dates. So if that is useful to be able to just copy and maybe change a day. Okay, so I said we're in design, so I probably don't actually have an actual date yet for Board of Regents approval, but also this is a non-capital project, so that particular one might not apply. But I would enter my plan, projected, and actual dates for each milestone and hit save. Again, always switching back to that form view. One thing I think I skipped over here is this item status. You'll see it's for information or for meeting report. You'll leave it as for information. What's going to happen is if this is going to capital governance, Chris may be copying your text and making, I think, what we referred to as digestible comments. But what your comments will always be retained. And the item status is simply to indicate what's going to populate the report that capital governance is going to generate out of the system. All right. You also note that once you've entered the budget, it does total up on all of your categories here. So we'll total the plan projected and actual for all of your budget categories. If you had any supporting documentation that needed to go to CapGov for review, so a feasibility study or programming option, you would attach those here. If it's not going to CapGov, you wouldn't, you could still attach something if you needed to, but of course not as critical. I'm going to go ahead and hit send. And again, we have our two options. So if this is not going to CapGov approval, you would send for updates. Or if you're just not ready to promote it for CapGov approval, you would send for updates. It simply goes back to yourself in a holding pattern until you're ready to make those updates. Now we see our status report has been created. If I open this back up, now in the hamburger menu, if I go to print custom, I have the option to print the quad chart. Now we see the information that we entered. So in that questions and recommendations tab, we see those listed here. The summary status is up here in the upper left, risks and concerns, our budget and our schedule, all with the indicators as selected, red, yellow, green. This is it gets a draft watermark because the process hasn't been completed yet. So this is kind of a work in progress. And we got a little note here, final version pulled for capital governance meeting only. And then there's a note about the status that the 4 information items will not appear on the final version. Okay. So sorry, this was sent for updates. So now I've got a task. If I didn't need to make any updates, I don't need to make updates, but I just need to pass this through. Or I can make updates and regenerate that custom or the quad chart. So I have a status report sent for updates. I'll accept my task. If I need to make any changes, I can. All tabs are editable. And then if I click send, I've got a couple options here. If I did this just to generate a quad report, or I just needed a status update, maybe a supervisor was interested in my current status and this is how I wanted to provide it, I can just say, yep, this is approved. I'm not going to CapGov, and this is a non-capital project. So if one was created, chances are this is what you'll be doing. If we're in a capital project or the odd non-capital project that requires oversight, we would select send for CapGov approval, which goes to the capital government's group, and it follows through their process. So again, they may be adding additional items that they want to appear on the final version for their purposes, and they may send it back to you for revision and to resubmit for the CapGov process. So just to show that, I'm going to send it for CapGov approval. So for you, it would drop out of your task list because this just goes to the CapGov folks, and then your status is just pending review, and you're basically waiting to hear back. So then Chris or Stacy or Alicia will be going through the projects that had their status report promoted for CapGov, and they'll be making a decision on what's going to be included in the next meeting, what's not going to be included. So they've got a limited amount of time. They might not be able to review your project in the next subcommittee meeting. So they're going to be making that determination. So maybe holding, waiting for that, or they may note something that they want you to change. So again, this step that we're seeing right here is only for CapGov. This is not a step that you'll be taking, but just so you can see into their process. If there's anything that needed to be reviewed, that should be attached already before you send it. And then they can decide if they're going to hold on to it for the next meeting or promote to the agenda. If they revise and if they select revise and resubmit, it's going to go back to you for revisions. If this is they can also no-go a project if it's early on in the process and it's just not going to meet muster. Or they can, after the meeting, they would then update and say it was approved. So it's kind of a two-step process for them, in that they need to determine whether or not it's going to show up for the meeting, and then after the meeting, they're going to come back and update this with the decision from the meeting. So let's say that's approved. Now the folks who are attending the meetings may change, and not everybody in the capital governance process is part or are users in Unifier. So typically, Alicia is updating Unifier with the decision after the fact. So this is going to be marked as approved, and you'll see it goes to end. And then in your project, the status of your status report will update to approved. Okay. Now, as you go throughout your project, you'll have multiple status reports, especially if you're a capital project. So you will be able to see older reports, and then at any time you'll be able to generate that custom print. I've shown you how to open or generate that print from within the record, from the hamburger menu. You don't necessarily have to open it to do that, though. So from the gear icon, not only can we copy a record, but we can also generate that custom print here as well without having to open the record. Okay. This is also related to gates for capital projects, because we want to make sure that we've got an approved capital governance review from the status report in each phase. Now I'm in a non-capital project, so that won't populate. But I am going to go ahead and refresh gates so we can see the other activities that we did today. So if I click refresh, my current phase has now jumped to concept design. If I go back to feasibility, I can see that my feasibility study is completed. and I have a signed project charter. And so I've met all of the conditions. These other two had already been answered in Gates checklist. So now I'm in concept design. For those who attended the schedule training, you may remember that I went into Gates checklist and updated my owner schedule. So I see that here checked. But we're still waiting for a couple of other things to move out of concept design. And that is status reports, project charter, and feasibility studies. So with that, I'm gonna stop the recording just in case anybody wants to see something again.